This is the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, where we bring research into real-world conversations. I'm Dr. Dion Stevens, your host, co-author of the Psychology of Black Womanhood book, and a professor of psychology. For too long, suicide struggles have been shrouded in silence within our communities. Yet the statistics tell us a sobering truth. Suicide rates among Black women have more than risen. They've accelerated, doubling among young Black females aged 15 to 24 over the last 2 decades, and it continued to climb during the pandemic years. What's driving this? It's not just one thing, it's a complex convergence of racial trauma, societal expectations, and systemic barriers to care. To explore this public health concern, we're talking with Dr. Kamesha Spates, the William S. Dietrich Chair and Associate Professor in the Department of Africana Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. A first-generation college graduate, she's bridging Africana Studies, psychiatry, and sociology to advance racial and health equity. Her work, recognized with numerous national awards, examines anti-Black racism, suicidality, and the mental health of Black communities. Her scholarship's been featured in public outlets such as Essence Magazine, US Today, and HuffPost. This topic that you're doing is something that's kind of taboo and can also be really stressful. Can you start off by telling us what drew you to study the issue of suicide among Black women?
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and share a little bit about the work I've been doing over the last couple of decades. So what actually brought me to this point is I honestly, if I'm honest, I stumbled on it. I was having a conversation with a mentor when I was in graduate school, and we were sitting in his office and we were both eating lunch, and he said, "Do you know why Black women's suicide rates are the lowest of all groups, various races and genders in the US? And always has been." And I thought about it and I said, "Well, yeah, I know." And he said, "Well, what is it?" I said, "Well, I believe it's social networks and kinship relationships. And I also believe it has a lot to do with faith and spirituality." And he said, "You're right. That's exactly what, some of the research is pointing to, but nobody's ever really looked at it." So after I left there, it was one of those questions that I couldn't put away. I couldn't pack away. So I started talking to friends and family and community members about that. And they were like, "Oh, you should look into that. Finally, somebody's pointing out something that we're doing that's good and not pathological," right? So I went into this initially looking to talk to Black women about protective factors. What were some of the things that were working well? And that study was incredibly encouraging. I got to talk to so many Black women from different facets of life, Muslim, Buddhist, some living abroad, some living in the US. But what I also started to see was that there was this dichotomy. There were Black women telling me on one hand that, we're strong, if I have a problem, I'm just going to call my girlfriend and vent and get it all out. But then the other side of it was a nice sized chunk of my sample had attempted suicide or seriously considered it, just shy of having a plan. Right. And so that didn't sit well with me either. Of course, I got the study done and wrote it up and things of that nature. But I also started to realize that there was this conversation that was not being had in our conversations, right? And so then that drew me in, and I thought about my own family, the silence, the things that have happened that nobody really knows about. And it just got me curious and interested to really break into that space and learn more.
I think that's interesting. You were talking about the statistics. What do the current statistics tell us about suicide rates among Black women? And have there been any shifts, particularly in recent years?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So what we do know is from about 1999 to 2020, there's been a 53% increase in suicide deaths among all Blacks in the United States, right? So we're talking 53%. That's significant. But when we look at Black women, we have a interesting trend that folks are really starting to pay attention to. We are seeing these increases, significant increases, and then there are some subgroups in certain age groups within the group of Black women that we're seeing that are a bit more impacted than others. But what I can tell you, and those are the youth, we're talking 12 to 24, where we're seeing those significant increases of Black girls and women. But I'll also say this, the community is now aware. We have the attention, right? And so it's gone from a conversation that you hardly ever heard talked about to something now that folks are really, really struggling with how to move forward and how to best support Black women in this capacity.
I know the research shows there are gender differences in the way individuals attempt suicide and their actual completion of the act. Like men are more likely to use guns and women are less likely to actually die from the attempt due to how they try to commit suicide. Does suicide look the same for Black women? Are their thoughts or actual enactment strategies the same as other groups?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think it's definitely something we need to learn more about. One of the studies that we oftentimes will reference, those statistics come from governmental agencies, the Census Bureau, the Center for Disease Control, the Office of Minority Health, and what we know is that, as you pointed out, men are more likely to use what we would consider to be a more lethal method. In other words, we're talking firearms, we're talking methods that rarely ever result in the person surviving in comparison to women. Women are more likely to use, like you mentioned, less lethal means. It could be things like taking an overdose in various ways in which, the person technically may not necessarily die because of their behavior. But what I will say too, in addition to needing more research in that area, is people use what they have. So when you have an individual that has suicidal thoughts, they've created a plan to die by suicide, the first thing most people do is they look around in their current space. So if you're a physician, we've seen that physicians are more likely to utilize drugs of some sort.
Right.
If you're a police officer, a Black woman police officer, then those are the ones that are more likely to utilize a firearm, right? So we also have to think about what this individual has access to. And if there's ever any concern, definitely doing all you can to remove those means from in their care.
Could you go back to that discussion like you were talking about subgroups? What are the particular age groups, regions, or social contexts where Black women are especially vulnerable to this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so when I talk about age groups, we're talking from the age of 5, believe it or not, all the way up to 84. Wow. So what we see between the ages of 12, which aligns with middle school, puberty, some of the other physiological things that are happening in the body of these young girls, all the way to 17. That is by far the area where we see the largest spike, and where Black women and girls self-report as strongly considering suicide.
Why is it that age group? Why is it?
See, this is the thing. Unfortunately, historically, we're late to the party, right? Like, we didn't get to looking at this topic for decades, right? So a lot of this is really unfolding in real time, and we're doing our best to learn more about it. But from the preliminary work that's been done, young Black girls are more likely to spend larger amounts of hours online than other groups. And so we know that online, I hate to use this blanketed statement, but online is not necessarily great for your mental health and mental well-being. So we know that that is a significant factor in terms of young Black girls or younger, even young Black women, the time they spend online. We also know that it is a time of life of transition. The vast majority, if not almost all, mental health conditions emerge by the age of 24. So this is a time in lives where they're heading off to college, or they're in high school, or they're dating. And so you have these various dynamics with gendered racism, where where Black girls are being discriminated against, Black women, I should say as well. And because of those different scenarios and the ways, unfortunately, in which the school settings have not stepped in to support Black girls and Black women in the way they need to, we're seeing that as a really high stress point and also a really high death rate and the suicide attempt rate as well.
You've kind of just touched on this. So how do the intersections of race, gender, and class, and sometimes sexuality then shape Black women's unique mental health experiences across the lifespan, particularly as it relates to ideations of suicide?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Again, we're late to the party. And so we're just now starting to unpack these things. I'll just give a quick, brief historical context. I remember when I first started looking at suicide, the death rate among Black women was very difficult to find because for decades, the statistics showed either white or non-white. And then eventually it went from white to Black, still no gender. And then later on, maybe closer towards the 70s and 80s, we started to see suicide statistics about Black women that had been pulled out of that. And so across the lifespan, what we know is that Black girls and Black women are dealing with significantly higher chronic stress, right? And so I know that's a broad term that could mean a ton of things, but one of the things that is significant and has been for some time about chronic stress is we're looking at gendered racism. We're looking at discrimination in the workplace. We're looking at economic inequality and Black women still being paid significantly less than white men currently today. We're looking at various social issues that impact Black women in ways, and girls in ways that I don't think that science acknowledged earlier on. So we're carrying these burdens, right? We're carrying these bags. One example that I like to share is if you imagine yourself carrying a backpack. And that's for racism. You carry another backpack, put that on top. That's for sexism. And then you're asking, and let's say you ask, folks to walk up this hill. So Black girls and Black women are carrying a significantly higher and heavier burden, and it's chronic stress. And the interesting thing is, as a society, we, instead of training the Black woman to carry the bag and climb the hill more efficiently, we need to think about the terrain itself. Yep. So as we are moving forward in this work, trauma, discrimination, sexual orientation, things of that nature, the farther away you get away from what we consider the norm in society, white male, the more likely you are to see these negative psychological outcomes as a result of trying to navigate the world in that way.
I liked how you used the term "we're late to the party" for this research. And clearly, like you said, a lot of it's societal. We didn't consider Black women. We didn't do research on it. But even still, there's not a lot of Black women doing work on suicide specifically. What's going on? Why is it that we don't even want to talk about it, even at the individual level? We have so many Black women that are mental health providers. What do you think is the issue?
That is a really good question. I'm glad you asked me that. I have experienced that my entire career. There's a couple of us and we're kind of in this circle and we know each other and we cite, those sorts of things. But I think in part, it's because of what I would consider to be systemic erasure. Black women in suicide research has been non-existent. And even in cases where there were, let's say, media outlets or sources that they would give information without linking it to the person's name. And now I'm talking like in the 1800s, early 1900s. Right. So there were these cases that were happening, but they would say, oh, well, it was likely due to insanity. And then there's no name to track this back to. So I think the scientific erasure and neglect in the discipline has really written, intentionally or unintentionally, Black women out of that conversation. I actually had a Black colleague, a Black female colleague. She said, "Really, you're looking at suicide? Like, are you sure? Is that a problem?" And so, of course, that was 10 years ago when she asked that question. But there was no funding. In academia, it's all about the problem. What is the problem? Where are the numbers? How can you justify the need to spend time in this space? And that opportunity just was not there. And the last example I'll give is, for instance, the American Association of Suicidality. For decades, it wasn't until the 90s that they actually started having sessions at their conference on suicide in Black communities. So then there was no place necessarily for Black social scientists to go and talk about these issues, at least scientifically speaking or academically. So I think that's in part that, and then of course the funding disparities as well, because it was not seen as a problem for very long.
I think this is really important, this link towards representation, or like you said, the erasure of even in the scientific community and popular culture. And I'm thinking there has been a lot more awareness, like you said, more popular cases, at least in Black medias, around Black women who have committed suicide. The suicide of Dr. Antoinette Bonnie Candia Bailey, who was a vice president at Lincoln University. There were several others. But I'm wondering if the ways in which Black women's lived experiences around mental health and suicide are framed differently in broader conversations than other women's.
Yes, absolutely. I think the research really affirms that. And the reason I point to that is because if we think about a Black woman that's struggling with mental health issues, Black women are less likely to go and seek help than most groups, all groups actually. And the reason that becomes important is because when they do seek help, they're in a much more severe state.
Right.
And so when you think about, okay, what does mental health look like in Black women? It's either, high functioning depression where people are like, well, but you know what? I get it, but she has it. She can still do it. I know she's succeeding here and there and all these other places. And this is the friend nobody checks on, right? And then on the other side of that, you think of someone who literally would need to be placed inpatient for psychiatric treatment because of this perception that either you got it or you don't, right? And there's no middle ground. And so I think that plays a significant role in how Black women's mental health issues are framed, as well as treated, even among clinicians.
So when Black women do attempt suicide or there's concerns about their suicide ideation, are they treated differently by the system?
Unfortunately, yes. We have research to affirm, decades of research actually, to affirm that Black women are more likely to be misdiagnosed with a mental illness. They are also more likely to be overly diagnosed with a much more severe condition than what they actually have. In part, some of the conversations around those things, it's about the ways in which Black women's symptoms appear or their symptomatology. And so with that in mind, Black women are less likely to show the signs that you typically think of. And so something else that happens in the system, unfortunately, is when Black women get to a place where they do require inpatient psychiatric treatment, there are disparities in terms of how they're being treated, even when they're at their most vulnerable state. And so the research is showing, too, that Black women are more likely to be, when in an inpatient setting, they are more likely to be restrained than other groups. Other behaviors being relatively similar, they're more likely to be constrained, whether it be through chemical restraints, such as drugs and various cocktails to calm the individual down, or whether we're talking about physical restraints where they are literally tied to their beds and things of that nature. So unfortunately, at every stage in the process, Black women are less likely to receive the type of care and empathy that other groups receive.
Let's dive into your research. What were some key findings that you think were really groundbreaking or really important to think about?
Yeah, well, one of the findings that I think was extremely important to highlight was the fact that I had such a large sample of Black women that had considered suicide as an option, or had attempted, or had someone in their family that had died that way. Right. So that immediately blew the lid off of everything, because we could say, hey, I know people aren't writing about it, but this is happening. The other piece that really came up was just the massive opportunities and claims in the research that talked about underreporting and also perceptions of what that death might have been about or by, right? So some of the research talks about how Black women's actions, because of the means that they may choose when to take their life, that those are typically less fatal. And so it's more likely to be seen as some sort of an accident or, an unfortunate, situation. And so I think that came up in my research as well. There was just this underreporting. To my dismay, which I was shocked about, there was so many women who had been, exposed to the conversations because of things in their own families or they themselves. And so there was the other pieces, there was this culture of silence, right, around what it meant to consider suicide. What does it mean, and to take your own life, and the complexities and the nuances that are integrated into that when it comes to Black women's faith and spirituality. So one of the pieces that came up in my research, I'll never forget this interview. I had two different I'll talk about the one. I had this one interview, and it was with a woman who lived in a community where two of her neighbors had lost their son. And these are Black neighbors, Black sons. One lost their son to suicide. The other lost their son to a homicide. They were killed in a shooting. And she talked about how the neighborhood really rallied around the woman who lost their son due to gun violence. And they were cutting her grass, and they were taking her food, and they were checking in and doing all these different things. But the other woman had been a neighbor just as long. Folks didn't know what to say. They didn't know what to do. And I don't think she didn't mention that they were intentionally doing these things. It was just this level of discomfort of, well, I don't know how to handle that. And did her son go to hell? That was another piece.
Right.
So it ended up being, based on her description, this woman was very socially isolated from the neighborhood. Whereas in the past, for past things, they would all get together and celebrate.
I think that's really important, that it's not just the suicide affecting the person who's the victim, but also the people around them. You brought up this sort of stigma in Black communities. How does this affect our willingness to talk about this and even address it?
Yeah. So one of the things that kind of impedes these conversations is the cultural perception or norm that there are certain things you just don't talk about in the family, particularly things that are traumatic. I have a friend who her aunt passed away by suicide, and she didn't know until I started doing this research. She told her mom about the interview, and her mom was like, well, Auntie so-and-so, that's how she died. And she's like, what? Are you kidding me? How did I not know that? And so and her mother, wasn't necessarily trying. I think culturally speaking, that's not uncommon to keep certain things, where they need to lie, so to speak. So I think that's one reason folks aren't talking about it. The other reason is because when there is an opportunity to bring the topic up, people don't know what to say.
Yeah.
They don't know how to start the conversation. There's this myth that bringing it up or bringing the topic of suicide up with someone that might be having these thoughts would actually cause them or make it more likely for them to actually go forth and die by suicide. When in all actuality, we know the conversations themselves can be preventative. And so that's the other piece, equipping people with the tools, the techniques, the strategies, even the language, right? Words to stay away from that we no longer should mention because it can either be invalidating to the person or it can further stigmatize the individual. And so a combination of all of those things, I think, is what really has impacted the conversations or the lack of conversation and the silence around this topic. And honestly, perceptions that this is a white thing. This came up in my study quite a bit. I would say almost everybody said that. Like, well, is this something we really need to be concerned about? Isn't this a white thing?
What do they mean by this is a white thing?
Yeah. So they mean that if you hear I literally had a participant say to me, if you were to tell me to close my eyes and you describe a certain situation, I can tell you if it's a Black person or a white person that did it.
Right.
And she said, and suicide is one of those things. I can tell you that if you were to describe a story without giving me any demographic information, I would assume that it's a white man. Just not even seeing the ways in which a Black woman may move from depression or some other mental illness all the way to the point of taking her life. Just not being able to see that, it just seems like an anomaly, you know?
I became familiar with your work through your empirical research, your articles, but what I really appreciate is that you have your book, What Doesn't Kill Us Makes Us Stronger. It sort of, you took all that research and you made it accessible to the community, which I think is great. And I wanted to talk about one thing that you did do is that you really centered Black women, had them speak for themselves about their life struggles and their notions of suicide. Two things I want to ask about that. One, how was it to get women to participate in sharing these stories? And two, why did you do that? Why was that important for you?
Well, I'll start with the second question first. I was very frustrated by the lack of scientific information. Mm-hmm. After I had this conversation with my mentor, I started talking to family members and community members. I, did what an academic would do. I sat down at the library and started searching the journal articles. And I was really taken aback by how little there was that was present. And I was also incredibly committed to various principles of Black feminist thought and intersectionality and the importance of centering Black, in this case, Black women's voices on a topic that nobody had really written about. And it's interesting because at that particular time, there were a few, well-known scholars that said, well, we don't know much about it, but, somebody should look at it.
Somebody should.
So I guess the somebody was me, and so that's how I ended up, really stepping into that role. Just so frustrated because I knew that it was happening, but I had very little literature or evidence-based research to guide my next steps. So going to the next question, it was very important for me to allow Black women's voices to be centered in this project. It wasn't about me. It wasn't about science at that point. It was about allowing the women a place where they can open up and share their thoughts, perceptions without feeling judged. And believe it or not, it was not hard to find participants.
Really?
In part because I frame this study as, we're looking at these low rates of suicide. Let's talk more about Black women's perceptions. What do you think is going on here, right? So when I tell you I sent out my recruitment flyer, I was bombarded.
Wow.
Because they were like, again, man, we get to talk about something we're doing, right? Absolutely. I can tell you what's going on. It was encouraging for them to be able to have those conversations. But of course, knowing back in hindsight, after finishing all of the work, it was also important to note that things weren't always great, right?
So you point out some of the things that are the strengths. So looking ahead, clearly you said families, communities, faith-based organizations, those are really critical in supporting Black women who are experiencing suicidal thoughts. So what kinds of interventions or education, or you even brought up language, needs to be brought to these spaces to further ensure they remain a buffer against these types of outcomes?
Yeah, and I think that's the meat and potatoes of the work, right? Is interventions, being able to stop folks in a moment of crisis from actually, taking that next step. And so interventions need to be culturally strategic. They need to be specific to the group. And so I've really been pushing for the disaggregation of data. I know that we have these statistics now that we've consistently had from the Center for Disease Control and at the state levels and so on and so forth. But they really do not get at some of the cultural nuances that are happening throughout the life course, right? Whether we're talking age, we're talking sexual orientation, whether we're talking, higher income earning Black women versus, other economic classes. And so I believe the interventions need to be culturally specific, not just to Black women, right? Because that's a big label to slap on something, but specifically to adolescents. Middle-aged Black women, aging, maturing. I think I saw on one of your podcasts, maturing Black women. I like that one quite a bit. Black women that are dealing with perimenopause, Black women that are in menopause. We need specific interventions for these groups.
So how do culturally grounded interventions or healing practices look for you if you were doing it for Black women?
Well, I'll start out with a disclaimer that I am not a clinician.
Yeah.
But what I would say is, one, we disaggregate data. So I would look specifically at a group, very narrowly speaking, right? And so it may be, let's say, Black adolescent girls in Pittsburgh, right? I might look there to start. And I would also incorporate peer-led interventions in groups. One thing that the research area of eating disorders has come up with that has been very successful, even among Black youth and adolescents and older groups, has been these peer-led support groups. Right. And so this is where you come in and you find an individual who is willing to, share their story and be open about what some of their struggles have been and some of the things that has helped them to cope with those particular issues and lead the group, right? Because if we're looking at supporting this one particular age group, it needs to be somebody they can relate to. You can't bring grandma from the church in there. I mean, you could, but it may not be as impactful of a conversation. Yeah, it hits differently. Absolutely. Something else that I would integrate would be digital technology. Everybody has a cell phone. In fact, if we're talking still the youth, they are better at technology than many of us are. And so looking at ways to integrate digital technology into these types of support groups. And so one would be in community. If I had to backtrack, I put get in community with that particular group. Two would be finding peers to help co-lead these sessions and these conversations in a way that shapes the culture, right? And then the third thing, of course, would be looking at interventions that they could tap into at any time of the day or any time of the night, which would be more than likely something on the digital scale.
So if you could leave listeners with one thing to remember about suicide and Black women's experiences, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a good one. I would say that suicidal deaths cannot adequately be explained by an individual behavior or individual pathology. While that is a helpful vantage point, we need to think more holistically about what it is that Black women endure or encounter on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. And so consider not just what's happening internally, but what's happening around them. Mm-hmm. When I gave the analogy earlier of, changing the terrain as well as training Black women better, more efficient ways to climb the hill, that's key, right? And so looking at the structural conditions and the social conditions that are shaping these behaviors needs to remain at the forefront of the conversation. From just my research throughout the years, I've encouraged folks through implications, therapy would be great. Culturally sensitive therapy would be great, right? And that is still the case. However, I've also seen the other side of that where researchers or advocates lead Black women to the couch, the therapy couch. Mm-hmm. And it's harmful because the therapist is not culturally sensitive. I always say, what does it take to get a Black woman on the couch? Like, think about all of the things that deter them from that, whether it's the culture of silence, misperceptions of who actually does die by suicide, being in a more severe mental state when they do seek help. And this historical mistrust that is incredibly rationalized, right? Like it makes total sense. All of those things are, not including insurance and accessibility and transportation and all the things. So again, keeping those things in mind and thinking about interventions on a social level and not just on an individual level.
So what's next for you in terms of your research? What are you looking forward to working on?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I am currently working on incorporating virtual reality into these conversations. And so what I'm doing is, for instance, in one of my classrooms, I'm teaching a graduate seminar on mental health in the Black community. And my graduate students and I are creating virtual spaces for specific groups, because I talked about disaggregating the data, and housing and creating these spaces for the people that they are looking to inform clinicians about, and so on and so forth. Okay. And so this virtual space is supposed to be a virtual healing space. And so I have one group that's working on Black fathers in their 20s. We have another group that's working on Black women and binge eating during middle age. So you see how specific these are getting, right? And then we have another one that's working with multiracial adolescents in the United States. We're going to have these virtual spaces that we create utilizing the research and moving beyond that to get into some of the spaces to gather culturally specific knowledge that oftentimes may not be included in the research. It could be a documentary. It could be, an Instagram post of someone who has millions of followers talking about the issue. And so we're hoping that this is something that can be open to the public at some point in maybe an exhibit capacity. And so, I have this interest in integrating the technology. I think the other piece of what I'm working on too is looking at ways of optimizing Black women's well-being. So not just, how can we improve mental health, or how can we train clinicians to better respond? I mean, those things are certainly still going to happen, but we also want to give Black women spaces to connect collectively and talk through some of those wellness strategies. Also consider this cultural preservation, right? I think back to my grandmother and my great-grandmother and some of the techniques and strategies that they used were incredibly helpful. And of course, we didn't know them to be scientific at that time, but we want to also hold on to some of that ancestral knowledge that we have that speaks to healing, that speaks to, restoring ourselves and our overall well-being. And so looking to do some more work around that. And I just recently got trained in Soabani healing circles to be able to facilitate those. So I am also going to begin doing some of that work with Black mothers who are caretakers, juggling it all and working and all the things, and creating these safe spaces and culturally strategic spaces for them to thrive.
We're so glad you tuned in, and we hope that this conversation sparked new thoughts and ideas. Insights from guests like Dr. Spates is really helpful for bringing research into our everyday life and giving it meaning in a way that matters to us as Black women. Your support for this type of work is what keeps us going. When you share this podcast, leave a review, or recommend it to someone in your circle, you're helping to amplify voices and stories that matter. And don't forget to grab a copy of our book, The Psychology of Black Womanhood. Stay tuned on Instagram, Facebook, and Threads, or visit our website at www.psychologyofblackwomanhood.com to explore more of what we're building. Again, thanks so much for being here. Until next time, let's keep blending our lived experiences with research and centering the realities of Black womanhood.